Tyler Cole. Tyler is the Director of Carbon Intelligence at FreightWaves. His role at FreightWaves is to evangelize net zero freight through weekly newsletters and podcasts, while also directing software product development efforts in measuring, benchmarking, and reducing freight emissions. So Tyler, over to you.
Ian, thank you. And thanks to Peter and the team for really putting on a great event and the opportunity to share my perspective. I may take a different approach than Aviv and Dan. Just given my role, we're going to look at a more macro level view for really why we should be bullish about opportunities to decarbonize freight. So consider it more of a call to arms for the finance sector to elevate the importance here of financing a low carbon freight future. So as you said, I'm Tyler Cole, Director of Carbon Intelligence at FreightWaves. FreightWaves is the leading source for freight and logistics news and analytics. And in my role, I really get to focus on the broad array of opportunities to decarbonize freight and logistics while working with our team to deliver software that helps customers really measure, benchmark, analyze their freight logistics emissions. So I guess backing up, I love the freight industry. It touches everything, every physical supply chain in every country on earth. It's a $9 trillion global industry, without which the world economy ceases to function, as we saw at many points and in many places recently. But as vital as mobility is to human flourishing, it's also responsible for a large share of global emissions. Transportation alone was responsible for 8.26 gigatons. It's about 26% of global CO2 equivalent emissions in 2018. Light duty vehicles are roughly 40% of that. And I think we generally would agree that we've reached a consensus that the quickest path to decarbonize passenger vehicles and light duty trucks is to electrify. Most major automotive OEMs are committing to increasing EV options or totally phasing out ICE engines by sometime next decade. And we're witnessing huge investment announcements in battery manufacturing, recycling, EV assembly plants. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about reducing passenger and light duty emissions vehicles because honestly, I'm kind of on board with the path. I can't wait to get my next EV when it's time to replace my vehicle. But where does that leave us? We've got this big residual pile of heavy, hard to abate, heavy duty transport emissions. Given that we expect the global economy to continue to grow, the freight market should increase by about 50% through 2050. How do we decarbonize these remaining sectors profitably while not stifling growth? So I think it's important to lay the ground here and say, let's just clear up a few things. First, we will not be able to fully decarbonize freight and logistics without breakthrough advances in vehicle propulsion, fuels, and technologies. Now, we have a ton of tools at our disposal today to reduce emissions. So we have to continue to do these things like digitizing supply chains, creating, using, and sharing increasingly relevant, especially emissions data, which will help us reduce costs, eliminate waste, and improve network risk modeling. We've got to continue to eliminate empty miles through network coordination and redesign. We can continue to improve vehicle routing efficiency, equipment utilization. We've got to keep shifting goods onto lower emitting modes like rail and ocean. And we see at FreightWaves billions of dollars pouring into freight tech startups from VC funds. And that trend will continue because it's trying to do the work of tackling inefficiencies in a largely analog industry that touches everything. So my hope is we wring millions of tons of CO2 out of our supply networks just by executing the vision of reducing waste and improving efficiency, but that still leaves an enormous pile of emissions for us. So to repeat, we cannot move to a net zero freight future without systemic change to the fuel supply. We've got to remember that we've seen fuel and energy transitions happen before. So we need to align on what factors contributed to those previous changes to help us chart the path forward. Because the energy system, truthfully, is always in transition. And those transitions are typically driven by long-term economic and social forces and not just political ones. And they tend to play out over decades. So when we think about freight, let's consider other analogs to look back to. So point out, the shift from locomotive engines, from woody biomass to coal power, and then again from coal to diesel. Each one of those shifts allowed industry to grow the total market scale because the improvements were to their operational efficiency and lower costs. Imagine being a steam locomotive stakeholder and thinking about, well, what are we going to do with all these water stops every 50 to 100 miles when we switch away to diesel, right? Similarly, in the 30s, railroad companies had to be skeptical of switching from coal to diesel. Why would they sacrifice more payload just for a less powerful engine? But what we see happening was the improved range, reduced operating and maintenance costs, Those were the key benefits that accelerated market adoption. Now, one more thing, imagine on top of those savings, you now have this public excitement around a groundbreaking streamlined train, bringing people out to the hillsides and crowds to look at this new diesel futuristic technology. It starts to sound kind of similar to what we've seen in passenger EVs today. So what if the Tesla or the Tesla Semi is the best comparison we have to the Burlington's famous Zephyr train that really switched to diesel? Now, for me, thinking about those shifts, mine was more recent. I began paying attention to alternative fuels in the late 2000s. I was caught up, probably like many of you, by the prospect of American energy independence. I remember the Pickens Plan, T. Boone, the Oracle of Oil, how that homegrown mindset was going to usher in really a decade of increased investment, supportive policy, and ultimately the shale revolution changed everything. But in 2010, I was still convinced that we were going to see within a few short years mass market adoption of like CNG, LNG heavy duty trucks. I was a broker at the time, and I convinced my firm to go take out short-term leases. Let's pilot this technology for customers. And that program ultimately flopped, and we still have yet to see a meaningful volume of Class 7 and Class 8 trucks on the road running on natural gas. It's not to say it's not still there. We see CNG's made a big dent in transit buses. It's about 10 to 15% of those fleets. Large private, last mile deliveries like UPS, AT&T have thousands of natural gas trucks. And even more than that, we've seen the LNG tanker business just absolutely boom, really thanks to America's increasing gas exports. So as we point back to previous transitions, looking at natural gas as a proxy, we increased total energy demand, but it flowed to the most optimal use in that market, given the dynamics. So just long haul trucks didn't really need natural gas. We had better alternatives. Even though every fleet was interested in it and there was a major hype at the time, the broader fleet didn't transition away from diesel because we didn't see those meaningful lower operational costs or efficiency improvements. So when we think forward about the coming decades, how do we evaluate this new suite of technologies and policies? How is this investment cycle going to be different in freight tech or clean tech? For starters, I believe we're in an entirely new climate. Literally, the effects of climate change are visible, they're frequent, but the global political climate is also different than a decade ago. A general consensus, looking back at COP in Glasgow recently, is massive systems change is still needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change on a warming planet. We've seen the US rejoin the Paris Agreement. We've seen the EU pass its Fit for 55 plan to transform their economy, and nearly all major global emitters have a net zero goal. We all here on this call could debate timing and debate the path risk, but it's undeniable that the trend of policymakers is to pursue decarbonization. So we see proliferating clean fuel standards like those on the West Coast in Europe. We see how that's been successful at incentivizing production of low carbon alternatives. We see continued renewable energy standards, tax incentives, accelerating solar and wind deployments, and spending initiatives like the Infrastructure Act have carve-outs for refueling corridors and substantial R&D in things like hydrogen hubs, $8 billion. So we know, just to set the stage, policymakers are setting the table, and now industry's got to come make the meal, right? So in addition to these supportive policies, we're seeing corporates stepping up and supporting reductions in emissions and sustainable development. Thousands of companies have science-based targets, while many more have pledged support and invested in new technologies to reduce emissions in freight. Honestly, I lose count if I try to keep up with all the acronyms and the actors and the organizations that are announcing new pledges every week. But to me, it's a very bullish indicator when we see large freight buyers coalescing around future procurement pledges. So from the First Movers Coalition to the Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance, large buyers and beneficial cargo owners they have their hands in there saying, bring us these solutions, let's go. So we see corporates and policy working together. And the result of this trend, really in addition to potentially a rethinking of values during pandemic lockdowns and loose monetary policy, we've now got this burgeoning ecosystem of solutions providers for low carbon freight. The best and the brightest minds are spending their time trying to solve this problem. The most talented graduates and engineering minds are making their way into the sustainable supply chain space. And all that makes me really optimistic, because in the end, we have to de-risk the path to profitably decarbonizing freight. So I'm a big believer, because of all this, that we will see the freight industry adapting and accelerating a lot of these new breakthrough technologies in the near future. Think about the ubiquity of low-cost renewable energy and batteries, and how advances there are going to power really second order mobility technologies that were previously uneconomical. If you look at trucking, that means it gets the benefit of improvements in battery technologies for EV and fuel cells, because you've got ongoing complementary development and long-term storage and innovation. Most likely, when you think about electric trucking, it's fleets that will operate regional duty cycles, hub and spoke networks, because for longer haul trucking, hydrogen is kind of the play, although to me, it's got a little bit of a CNG in 2010 type feel, meaning I believe in the overall growth for the molecule is going to be exponential, but I don't know that there aren't better markets for it than long haul trucking. Now, hydrogen is completely going to get a chance to play a role there, but I expect it's going to have a lot of competition, specifically from advanced biofuels in the next 5 years, especially if we see policies continue to proliferate, promoting zero carbon technologies. And even beyond biofuels, electrofuels, I think, are an enormous opportunity and over the road. I personally get excited if you think about a carbon neutral electrofuel and then pair that with a mobile carbon capture at the tailpipe for almost a negative emissions truck. That to me is just beyond exciting. When you talk about aviation, though, it's probably a lot harder than ground transport, right? That industry is always focused on efficiency and operational improvements and really offset purchases rather than wholesale technology change. But reductions from those improvements continue to be incremental. And if we look forward, the expected growth in air travel over the long term is going to continue to outstrip many of those advances. So we need more startups. Startups focusing on like battery electric aviation are really targeting these short haul flights. We need battery densities to improve in order to extend that range. eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing startups are super interesting, but they've got a lot of additional challenges. It's an untested business model when you're talking about air taxis. There's lots more policy hurdles, airport and hangar storage and maintenance availability. I don't know that we have enough pilots. I'm hopeful that is a space that can prove decarbonized flight is viable and potentially disrupt incumbents, but it's got to be a proving ground because the bulk of aviation emissions really do rest on the shoulders of these large commercial emitters. So in my view, aviation is going to have to rely on a combination of sustainable jet fuel and hopefully extremely high quality carbon offsets in the near term and the medium term to decarbonize. So policies like CORSIA, which has got its pilot going on, fully implementation in 24, and other ones being discussed, like in the US, a sustainable jet blenders credit would really, really boost the viability of sustainable jet fuel in the medium term. And I'm optimistic we're going to get supply there ramping in the coming years. Finally, thinking through maritime shipping, I think it's going to decarbonize faster than other modes. I think it's got more tailwinds. It's a highly consolidated industry. It's really motivated by regulation. There's, upcoming efficiency standards and cap and trade regimes that are going to be putting additional burdens there on ship owners. But we're seeing ports cooperate with industry. We're seeing governments signal a willingness to invest in new infrastructure while defining green shipping corridors. Customers, again, are collaborating on procurement, signaling future demand. And I'm hopeful that vessel owners are able to parlay these recent windfalls from pandemic disruptions into new investments in cleaner technology. And we're seeing that. We're seeing, methanol and e-methanol ships being ordered. Order books are growing. Those type of fuels could be a game changer in this space, though we still have just a fraction of the supply of total bunker fuel. And it's going to take 3 to 5 years to start scaling up meaningful supply. There's ongoing debate too about other fuels, like what role is ammonia going to play in this? If it's an energy vector within the broader hydrogen economy, how is that going to fit into shipping, since we know how to ship it today? There are startups in this space demonstrating viability of battery electric shipping, which is fascinating. And it makes a lot of sense, but it's going to be relying on other changes like returning to smaller ship sizes, prioritizing resiliency and offering flexibility to ports that today can't receive these big supermax ships. But in the end, we've got to assume that whatever solution when solutions win out, they're going to demonstrate that ability we've seen in previous transitions to keep costs low and improve efficiencies. So I'd love to have a crystal ball. I wish I could tell everyone on here where to invest into the decarbonized future of freight, but from my vantage point, there's still a lot of pathways that might scale. And truthfully, it's not a bad thing, right? A resilient, low carbon freight future is going to allow for more than a few technology solutions to scale. I'm a big NBA fan, so I think of it like building a team. If I want to compete, I better make sure I've got multiple stars that can perform day in and day out. I need a deep bench with long defenders and accurate shooting. I need a price that the organization can afford and lots of draft picks sitting out so we can plan for the future. So let me wrap up briefly. Just want to include a few thoughts that inspire me and hopefully inspire you guys as well. So to me, the most bullish outcome in this world is one where we're not losing millions of lives from air pollution, where storms are less frequent and violent, and where we spend billions less on climate adaptation and healthcare. Breathable air is truly a human right. Everyone on this call's first experience was drawing a breath. So let's be good stewards of creation. Let's do well. Let's love our neighbor and do good at the same time. So make it your mission, if you're on this call, to accelerate a net zero future. Build a culture of measurement, curiosity, and intelligent risk-taking. Advocate for policies that support the adoption of low carbon fuels and freight technology. Start now, start yesterday, fail fast, but learn from your mistakes and weaponize those experiences and leadership in the marketplace, because if net zero is the goal, then collective action is all of our paths. So focus on what you can control today to accelerate that. And try to remember, as one of my favorite quotes, the quarry worker's creed: we who cut mere stones must always be envisioning cathedrals. So as we do our work and make our investments and scale these things, let's just hold this finished product of a thriving, carbon neutral global ecosystem in our mind. Appreciate you guys. Thanks.
Wow, thank you very much, Tyler. Great overview from marine to trucking, transportation. I don't know, you didn't refer as much to rail. I wonder if you have any insights about that. I see you nodding your head, so why don't we go with that?
Yeah, absolutely. The rail sector is going to move a similar path as surface transport, and especially in the US. I think over in Europe, it's going to be a little different, where multimodal is a much clearer focus, and electrifying the rail there is a higher priority. In North America, it does feel like the future is closer to increasing biofuel use and looking at some version of electric for short haul yard moves, and then potential fuel cells over the longer term. But those are decades long investments that those companies are looking to make.
Yep. Interesting about the fuel cells. I remember years ago, I think I remember seeing a locomotive that had been retrofitted with a large scale fuel cell to serve basically as a mobile power station. So yeah, again, across
so
the
many
borders,
fascinating technologies there, and the rail too feels a little bit less pressure than a lot of other modes. Most of the class ones in the US have science-based targets today, but they're targeting really operational improvements and engine efficiency over like wholesale technology change. And they have the benefit of, you know, being the greenest form of transportation compared to truck and other modes. So I'm curious,
I'd like to ask you something. You started talking, you toward the end of your presentation, you said, you'd love to be able to recommend where to invest the money, into which technologies, and so on and so forth. Over the last couple of days, we've also been talking about carbon offsets, the carbon markets, investment in nature-based solutions. So how can carbon offsets fit into the decarbonization of freight? Maybe freight is another one of these, reforestation projects, quote unquote, where who would have thought it? But again, strange bedfellows. Well, any thoughts about that?
Certainly, yeah. I spent the previous year before joining FreightWaves in the voluntary carbon space, and there's a lot of opportunity there. I think we're going to quickly see demand outstrip supply for the typical solutions in freight. If you're a freight market participant, I think it's valuable to measure your emissions and consider how you get to net zero, and offsets should play a part of that. But do your homework, make sure you're partnering with quality solutions that are part of a well-known registry that have all the documentation that you need. Don't get freewheeling with what you're claiming to offer. But there's also a space, I think, for carbon insetting in this opportunity. You look at how large corporate firms don't always have control over their granular suppliers. If their tiers removed from the freight moves happening upstream or downstream, there could be an opportunity for those emission reduction changes, whether it's fuel, new EVs, technology changes, behavior changes, to be quantified and sold. And you're investing now in upstream within your supply chain to accelerate decarbonization, but we need some clear methodologies and carbon accounting rules around that to develop before that can really happen at scale, in my opinion.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tyler. We are right on time.